Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lab. I'm recording this on September 24th, 2013. The lab is a new channel for Let's Code test-driven JavaScript that is focused on experimentation, exploration, and just general messing about. Unlike the other two channels, the live channel, which is about developing a real application using real-world development practices, or the Lessons Learned channel, which is about condensing down real-world experience into bite-sized nuggets, the lab is for experimenting with new ideas. Anything and everything that doesn't belong into one of those other two channels might end up here in the lab. Today in the lab, we're looking at Grunt, the JavaScript task runner. Now, nearly since the beginning of the screencast, people have asked me why I use Jake, another JavaScript task runner, instead of Grunt. Now, I've had my reasons, but today in the lab, I want to find out if those reasons were actually true. So my bias, my reason for avoiding Grunt, whether or not it was valid, is that I have a general dislike of configuration-based build tools. I prefer build tools like Jake that are focused on allowing you to run normal JavaScript. So Jake is a tool that allows you to define tasks and then just run JavaScript inside them. And although I didn't know a lot about Grunt because I was already familiar with Jake and happy to just use what I already knew, one thing I had heard about it is that it is a configuration-based tool, not a programming-based or imperative-based tool. Today, though, I want to find out if that's actually true. What I'm going to do here is take the Automatopia Lessons Learned project that we created quite a while ago that has all kinds of really great build automation in it that's all written in Jake, and I want to rewrite that in Grunt. And then we can do a side-by-side comparison of the two, which is simpler, which is better, which is easier, and which is more easy to maintain. Now, the reason I'm biased against configuration-based build tools is that my fear is that a configuration-based tool makes some things really easy. Basically, anything that there's already a plugin for, a configuration-based tool will make really easy, at the cost of making things that are custom, specific to your needs, much more complicated. And it's my experience that really great build automation depends on lots of stuff that's custom to your specific project. So it's important to me that not only it be easy to get things going, but that it be easy to maintain in the long term. So my fear with Grunt has always been that it would be easy to get going, but it wouldn't grow with us. So that's why I want to try rebuilding this fairly complex Automatopia build in Grunt and see how it plays out. Now, what we're going to be doing here, the Automatopia build has three pieces. There's the build itself, which has a lint component. It has a server-side test that uses Node Unit. It has a browser-side test that works with Karma and Mocha. And it also has a task that will start the Karma server for you. Now that's all fairly simple. Now, in addition to the automated build, our Automatopia build also has a fairly sophisticated continuous integration script. This is, again, all written in Jake. And what it does is it allows us to do continuous integration using Git branches and different Git repositories, taking advantage of the distributed nature of Git. And we also have a deploy script. And this deploy script is also written in Jake, and it will allow us to do things like deploy the latest code, the latest integrated code to Heroku, deploy the current branch to Heroku, roll back to a previous release, and check to see that the smoke tests pass on the server. So these are three major things that our Automatopia build does for it. It's all written in Jake. Now the challenge, what I want to explore today in the lab, is how well Grunt can do these exact same things and do a side-by-side comparison of the Jake code versus the Grunt code so we can see what works out better. So let's go ahead and get started. You can find the source code for this episode at the link on your screen. I am basing this on the Automatopia repository. I'm going to start out by just installing Grunt and also installing the Grunt command line interface. Okay, that looks like it's working. So I'll go ahead and make a shell script. There, and now I have the ability to run Grunt. All right, first thing I want to do is make the Grunt file. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, there's an empty Grunt file. It doesn't do anything yet. Now, I originally thought that Grunt was a entirely configuration-based tool, but that is actually not true. It does have a non-configuration based component. You can run code inside of your Grunt file, and you can register tasks that will run code. So I can theoretically just say hello world here, and that will run hello world. There we go. And I believe we can also give it a description. Yeah, so we can say grunt-h, and it will give us all the parameters for Grunt as well as tell us what the tasks are. I think I prefer the Jake approach of doing this, where you say jake-t and it gives you a much more concise listing of what your tasks are, but that's a fairly minor nit. Now that we've got Grunt, a basic Grunt file working, let's go ahead and tackle the first problem that we have. So in our Jake file, one of the most basic things we do is we lint everything. Now that's something that Grunt should make pretty easy. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get that working, and then we'll come back and see what it looks like. Okay, installing the JS hint module looks like it's pretty easy. Using it's fairly easy as well. Can't say I love this syntax, but it's not terrible. And now I should be able to say grunt help and see a JS hint task loaded for me. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that was pretty easy. Definitely living up to the promise of being really easy to get going. I installed the JS hint plugin for Grunt, and then I told it that I wanted to lint the browser code here. Source client ***/star.js, and it just did it. No problems whatsoever. But we're only linting the browser. Let's go ahead and lint our node files as well, and that's a bit more complicated. I'll go ahead and pull these in. I think that will work. Let's try it. If I run grunt, oh, it failed all over the place on my grunt file. Can't say I love their default output. You compare that to Jake's default output. Well, I say you compare it to Jake's default output, but the honest truth is that in order to get Jake to do linting, I had to write my own lint runner, and that took a couple of hours. So Grunt is definitely winning here, even though I think this is really ugly output. But that's okay. I can live with that. Okay, I think I see what's going on here. We're not using our options, so we really need to bring in the options in our Jake file. Luckily, that shouldn't be too hard. Okay, I've pulled over the options. Now these are just regular functions. The Grunt file is an executable code, so I should be able to just pull this in. Now the question is, how do I do that? So that worked, but now we're not getting our browser lint options. Okay, so this is the kind of thing that scares me about declarative tools. I have two different lint tasks I need to run, one for the browser and one for the node, and they have different options. Will the tool let me do that? I don't know. I'm going to go check it out. Okay, it actually looks really promising. The way the tool is configured, the plugin is configured, is that this is sort of the global options, and then what we can do, it's very clever, is we can specify files here with our custom options. Okay, so I've got JS hint working, and it went pretty smoothly. I have to say I'm liking the way Grunt worked here. Again, just to bring us back, in order to get this working, I had to load the plugin, and that was pretty much it. I hooked it into our default runner, and then I configured it up here. Now, I'm not sure if I like having the config file separated from the task like this. If we look at our Jake file, what we can see is that when we're doing a linting, so here we say lint everything, and we validate the files, and you can see all of the config is referenced right where it matters. And I do like that. I don't like having my code discohesive or decohesive, whatever the term is. This actually separates two important things, dealing with lint and then also defining it. But at the same time, I say that, but I don't know if that's a valid criticism because really the idea in Grunt is that this is your build, your config is your build, and that everything is relegated to plugins. Again, I'm not so sure about that idea, but score 1 for Grunt on JS Hint. Really clean, really simple, and the plugin had the power we needed, which was that to run different things. Now, Grunt does come out on top on terms of how easy it was to run lint. As I said, for Jake, I had to write my own lint runner. I like the output of it better, but that was a lot of work that you simply don't have to go through with Grunt. Let's go ahead and move on to the next task. So we've got linting working. Check that in. Our next task, our next challenge is we have linting working. The next thing we need to get working is testing the server. So we need to run node unit against the server. Now, I've already pulled out the code. Just like with lint, I've written a nice little module that will run tests with node unit, simple one-liner. Now, I did have to write that, although in theory, this could be published NPM and then other people could use it as well. And it's not specific to Jake either, so anybody could use it for any tool. But again, took me a couple of hours to write that. Let's see how Grunt fares. Do they have a plugin for node unit? We'll find out. Okay, I've got node unit working, and it was just as easy as JS Hint. Score another point for Grunt. We installed the node unit contrib plugin. We define the files that we want to test. We load the tests, and I suppose it would be a good idea to actually bring in node unit here. And then it's simply a matter of running Grunt, and it should run our linting, do our linting, then it runs node unit. Excellent. That is really nice and simple. So far, so good. Now, there is one thing I dislike about this, and that is that this is all based on the tools. We're saying run JS Hint or run node unit, but when I'm doing build automation, I want it to be about what I'm doing, not the tools I'm using. So I shouldn't say I want to run JS Hint. That's an implementation detail. What I want to say is lint or test the server. So somebody doesn't have to know that node unit means test the server. And if we ever change the way we test the server, we don't have to memorize new things. It's admittedly, I might be being a little bit nitpicky on this one, but that is how I feel. So let's see if I can figure out how to rename those tasks with Grunt. Okay, I did find a way to rename tasks so that we can have our default variable task be default lint and test server. And then when we run it, then it will run them properly. Now, the one downside of that is that the descriptions cannot be changed. But you know what? I think I'm nitpicking here. So let's just do it the Grunt way because it's not that bad. Okay, next on our list is getting Karma to work with Grunt, and we've got two pieces here. We need to automatically start Karma, and then we need to run Karma. So let's see how that goes. Okay, getting Karma to run was really straightforward. Same as before, we installed the Karma plugin, we loaded the task, we added a Karma section to our Grunt config, and then we can just run Grunt Karma, just like we run the Jake file. So that is pretty nice. I haven't figured out how to run the tasks yet, or run the tests once I've got the Karma server running though. So that is going to be next. Well, it looks like I might have found the first fly in the ointment with Karma. There is no way that I can see to use Karma the way I prefer to use it, which is to start the server, start all the browsers manually, and then just continually run my build file whenever I need to. You can run Grunt Karma, which will start the server and connect all the browsers, and that's great. It works, but there's no way to then run the tests, which is kind of ironic. It's set up so that you are either supposed to use Karma's built-in watch or Grunt's built-in watch, or run the server and start the browsers and then quit. But I don't see any way of manually triggering the build, which is what I want. I want to be able to say Grunt Karma : run or something like that and have it work. But of course, that doesn't work. And if I just type Grunt Karma again, then it runs another server. So that's no good either. So this is the first indication of the type of problem I had mentioned, which is that the plugins make something the stuff they want to do really, really easy, but make it harder to do the workflow the way I want to do it. Now, you could argue that my approach to the workflow is wrong and that I should just use the Grunt watch, and that is a valid that is a valid opinion. That's absolutely true that is one way to do it. But this is an example of the kinds of things that happen when you do an automated build. Whether or not this particular case is the greatest example, it is the kind of stuff that happens. The more and more sophisticated your stuff gets, the more you need to do stuff that nobody else has already prepared for you. So we're in that case now. We're doing something that the Karma plugin simply won't do for us. Now the question is, how hard is it going to be to make this work the way we want it to? So in Jake, we've got this little task right here. So can we do that nice and simply with Karma or with Grunt? Well, let's find out. Well, score another one for Grunt. That was really easy. Now, granted, we already spent a couple of hours writing this Karma utility, this Karma module that will run the test for us. But with the latest version of Karma 0.10, that became much easier. But actually calling it was very simple. The API for Karma Runner to run the tests is you send in the required browsers a success function and a fail function, and that actually worked really well with Grunt, where we set this to null for now, an empty list. We pass in this .async, which tells Grunt to run this task asynchronously, and then we passed in warn, which will cause the task to fail if there's a failure, and prints out the message. But, and this is actually something I really like about Grunt, it will give you the opportunity to bypass it, to force your way past. If I say Grunt test client, it will run all the tests for me. And then if I go into the test and I force it to fail by modifying one of the tests, you'll see it runs the test and fails just like it's supposed to, and gives us this client test failed, use force to continue. So that is very, very nice. I am pretty happy with that. So far, I would say that Grunt is definitely living up to its reputation. I think that my bias against it is turning out to be misplaced, because not only does it have all the config stuff, which is actually really nice when you've got a plugin, but it also gives you the ability to run functions, which is what other configuration-based tools I've worked with, like say Ant, which is a configuration-based tool for JavaScript, for Java, that was really difficult to work with when you needed to go outside the plugin library because you had to write a module in a different language. But here we can just put JavaScript right in line and it works great. So I might have to eat my words about Grunt. This is looking pretty good. So the next thing we need to do is check if required browsers are running. In our Jake file, we have this nice required browsers array at the top that we can basically, if we leave out one of the browsers that's in this list, the build will fail. So I'm going to try to get that working with Grunt. Most of the heavy lifting on that, by the way, is done by the Karma module. It's just something I wrote into the run tests code I've got here. So we will, since we're already using the Karma module, Karma Runner module, we'll be able to take advantage of that in our Grunt code. Okay, I've got Grunt supporting required browsers, and it's pretty clean too. If I run Karma, so I changed the task from test client to run Karma because that's more in line with the Grunt way of doing things. So here it is running against all the browsers. But if I come down here and close down Chrome and then run it again, it will fail out. It will say it didn't test all the supported browsers. And unlike that sort of hacky thing that we had in the Jake file where we had to say loose equals true, here we've got the more intuitive -- force option, which is also the standard approach in Grunt for forcing your way past warnings. So that is really, really nice. I like that a lot. And if I bring it back, of course, then everything works fine. Yeah, that's really slick. And implementing this was really easy to put it inside of the overall Grunt config file, which is also really nice. So I made this run Karma section. You can put anything you want in the config file. And I had to require browsers and just copied over that list from the Jake file. And then to use it, it's really simple. I say grunt.config, and then a string representing the path to the object I'm looking for. Just pass that into my runner, which again I already wrote for Jake. So yeah, score another one for Grunt. This is pretty impressive, I have to say. And that brings us to the end of the build script. Now, I do have other build scripts in here. I have the continuous integration build, and I have the Heroku deployment script. However, based on what I've seen so far, I think I've seen everything I need to see in order to really get a good feel for what Grunt can do. Because Grunt does make it really easy to run arbitrary code, those scripts, even though I doubt they would have good support, good plugin support, they will be just as easy to translate over from Jake to Grunt as this run karma task was. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to clean everything up, and then we'll be able to do a side-by-side comparison of the code and see what we see. I have to say, though, my first impressions really, really positive. And if I'd been familiar with Grunt when we'd started the screencast and we started working on WeWiki Paint, there's a very good chance I would have gone with Grunt instead of Jake. I am that impressed with it. Okay, here's a side-by-side comparison of the two build approaches. On the left, we have Jake and the Jake file, and on the right, we have Grunt and the Grunt file. And the differences in approaches is really obvious just looking at these here. You can see on the left, we've got a lot of task definition. That is the majority of what you see here at the beginning. And then some supporting functions. We define which files we're going to test, which files we're going to lint, and we define our lint options. On the right here in the Grunt file, it's dominated by this initial configuration, the initializing the configuration, which is all organized by task. And then there's a little bit of registering tasks, but that's clearly not the focus. And at the bottom, we have some helper functions for defining options, which honestly could just as easily been included in the config. I'm glad we didn't, though, because they're very verbose, and I think it would have made the config harder to read. As I look at this, one thing that I definitely notice is that the Jake file is longer by far. The Grunt file takes, if we exclude the lint option stuff, it's 54 lines for everything that matters. And the Jake file is 66 lines. Now, part of the reason for that is because, or actually, I take it back. It's not 66 lines. It's 72 lines before we get to global lint options. And the main reason for that is that defining the files is a lot more verbose in Jake than it is in Grunt. In a build file, you're going to be doing a lot of file operations, and Grunt has clearly built around that idea of making file operations really, really easy. So that is definitely a plus in favor of Jake, or in favor of Grunt, I should say. Now, the other thing I noticed looking at this, one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about is that the config file takes does so much of the heavy lifting of the Grunt file. This is really what you're supposed to look at in order to understand things. And as I've mentioned before, I prefer to look at code. I find that it's easier to read because this, you have to know how it interacts with all the tools. Over here, I just find this a little bit easier to read. When we say something like node unit.run tests, node files to test, that seems really straightforward to me. Whereas here we say node unit all this, you have to know a little bit more about how the node unit plugin works. That said, it is pretty obvious and straightforward. So here's my verdict. If I were to wrap this up, I have to say that a definite plus is the plugin library. It is absolutely as easy as promised. And getting JS Hint running and Node Unit running was far, far easier to do in Grunt than it was when I originally tried to do it for Jake. Also, the UI is really nice. I like the output of Grunt a lot more than I like the output of Jake. It's really clean and clear to see what's going on. The way it puts the tasks in there is nice, and the way it says done without errors at the end is nice. That is all really good. The one aspect of the UI, and the biggest thing I dislike about Grunt, the real downside of Grunt for me, is the task descriptions. Let me put these side by side. So if we run Jake-T, we get this lovely list of hand-built list of things that we can do. Here's the default. Here's, start Karma server, run this first. So really anything you want to do, you're going to do Jake-T. Same thing for the continuous integration script that we didn't do, or the deploy script that we didn't get into details on. It's just really nice. Now compare this to what Grunt gives us. First off, there's no way of just getting a list of tasks. You have to do the whole bit of help. And unlike everywhere else in Grunt, there's not really any coloring to make it obvious what to do. But worst of all, we don't get to say what everything is. It's okay, but it is the one place that I think Grunt falls down in comparison to Jake. And it's the one thing that I would suggest to the Grunt team to improve. And then there's one other little thing, and it's a little weird. Check this out. If I run Jake like this, it takes about 9/10 of a second. Grunt, on the other hand, is noticeably slower. It's slow enough that I actually thought to run the timing on it. You can see how much slower it is. And unlike Jake, which when it goes slowly, it sort of pauses at the end. I guess it's, cleaning up the process or something. You can actually watch it go across a lot more slowly. So instead of taking about 8/10 of a second, 9/10 of a second, it's taking 1.3, 1.4, 1.5 seconds. And that's interesting to me. And obviously, I don't expect Grunt to go twice as slow as Jake overall. And I suspect the reason Jake's going faster is because when I went through and when I programmed all the different runners into my version of Jake, I cared about speed. So I was really careful not to shell out. I would always call the APIs directly. I'm guessing that the Grunt plugins actually shell out and run the command line interface, and that's why they're so much slower. I haven't proven that. It's only about half a second. So it's not necessarily a big deal, but I did find it surprising. The last thing is purely a matter of preference. I can't say if this is good or bad, but I do feel that the Jake configuration is a lot more cohesive because I don't have a massive config file and I'm not expected to use a massive config file. What I end up with is just this nice set of tasks where everything's built in. So if I'm linting, I can see that I'm validating files, node files to lint, node lint options. Whereas here, my config and my tasks are deliberately separated. And maybe it's just an unfamiliarity, but those feel a little less cohesive than I would like. But that could just be unfamiliarity, and it's definitely going to be a point of preference for people because now the configuration is really nice and cohesive and easy to find. We'll leave that one up in the air. Final verdict for me, I like Grunt a lot. I do like it a lot. And if I hadn't already done all the Jake file for WeWikiPaint, I probably would give Grunt a very close look. It's not perfect though, and the main thing that bothers me is the lack of cohesiveness between tasks and options, and also poor descriptions for tasks and the difficulty defining loading tasks with exactly the name and description you want. That's the lab on Grunt. Definitely, if you haven't looked at Grunt, check it out. Right now, if I were to recommend for somebody to what they should use, I would say use Grunt because it's got so much more stuff built in. I think Jake could be a contender if there were more plugins for it. And that is actually something that I would like to perhaps contribute back, not to Jake specifically, but what I would like to do is I'd like to see more tools that are not build system specific, that you can just run from any build system. That kind of build agnostic tooling is useful, and maybe I will go out and create that, perhaps right here in the lab. Thanks for joining me. That's it for this episode. I will see you next time.